So, sound works? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Good. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm here speaking, I don't know, once, sometimes twice a year. And ordinarily, I don't mean to be really predictable, but most of the time I'm talking about holidays. And it's because, in case you wonder why I'm here with this topic, I'm going to get my clicker. A lot of years ago, I mean, let's see, not quite 15 years ago, I published a book about the history of Christmas. Christmas, A Candid History. And it's written for general audiences, and it's really, it says Candid History because people say, I want to know the real story. I think maybe my minister's sugarcoating some things. And so I was interested in that. And then a few years later, I did another book, which is this, whoops. Oh, there we go. Another book which is called America's Favorite Holidays, Candid Histories, and that's a chapter each on 5 different holidays. And if you don't know which holidays, you can see on the cover, can you? I mean, so it would be Valentine's Day and Easter, you like the little bunny and the horn, and Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas. And because of those 2 books, I mean, I have a lot of the speaking I do now, I just continue to be interested in these topics, and I come up with new tangents. So I've got a couple of friends who just call me the holiday guy. And a lot of the talks that I've given here in the past have been about some of those other holidays. Today, it's Easter, right? And I have to say, the approach that I'm going to use today, well, here's the way to go at this. I don't know what you expect this talk to be about. But a lot of times, we're going to talk about Easter, and it depends if you come from Christian background, what denomination. But usually, if you talk about Easter, it's all about Ash Wednesday, and then Lent, you're right, the 40-day period leading up to, and then Holy Week, Palm Sunday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. If you think I'm going to talk about the spiritual meanings of all that, not very much. It's like, if you want to know the spiritual meanings of all of those things, go to church. And if anybody here is a minister or a priest, I want to let you know I'm not trespassing too much on your territory. Although I just full disclosure, I am an ordained minister, but I also, for 40 years, taught as a professor of religious studies at Morningside College, now University, here in Sioux City. And so I'm not wearing my minister hat today, I'm wearing my professor hat, who has been really interested in the history of various holidays and all kinds of things that end up surprising me. Because as I did research on these 5 holidays, sometimes there would be questions that would occur to me that maybe it was in the back of my mind or maybe not. I'd think, I don't think I've ever asked that question before. Or in some cases, other people, because I'll give presentations as I'm working on my research and writing, see what interests them, and they'll ask me questions, and again, I'd say, I've never asked that before. So the way I'm going to structure what I talk about today is I'm going to keep asking myself questions, right, that I think might be similar to some questions you'd ask, and then we're going to wander around a little bit to get that question answered, and then here comes another question, and so we'll do wandering around for a little while, and I hope this will be interesting to you. All I know is that for me, over and over again, I was surprised. Either this was something I didn't know at all, or I'd never quite put it together that way. And I'd be interested if you have those reactions as well. So that's why the question mark. And there's a clock over there, by the way, which I can't read. And I have my watch here, although this is an old joke both about ministers or professors. And that is, do you know what it means when they put their watch on the podium? Nothing. So questions. The first one I want to ask, and I don't know if you've ever asked this. Have you asked this yourself? Why do Christians call Easter, Easter? Where'd that word come from? And Why don't Christians call it Resurrection Day, or I don't know, something else? Why do they call it Easter? And there's a related question for me, because I'm a Protestant, and I do have friends who are Eastern Orthodox Christians. So I'm talking about Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, you know. And if they talk about this season, they always call it Pascha. And I've always wondered, why do they call it Pascha? I mean, I think, why do they use that kind of unusual word when all the rest of us call it Easter? Of course, I didn't know why we call it Easter, right? So I want to take up both questions, and let's start with the Pascha question first, which has a quick answer and then I think a surprise. And I don't know why I'm looking back there, I know what's coming up, but basically, Pascha is a word that Eastern Orthodox Christians use, and it means Passover. And I'm not going to try to pronounce these words that aren't my language because I'll probably mess it up. But the Hebrew term is there on the screen, and when that gets translated to Greek, it's Pascha. And it's a word that means Passover, which of course is going to raise the question. I know Passover is a Jewish thing, but why are Christians calling this Passover? But here comes the bigger surprise for me. As I started to get curious about other languages, I know that if people are Eastern Orthodox, so Greek, Russian, Ukrainian, and that, they're going to call it the equivalent of Passover. But what about people in Western Europe and all the different languages? Started to look them up. Look at all these languages, and I know this is small. Well, you can read those words, right? But and frankly, a lot of those words should have various accents and so on, but I started to do that and then I messed it up, so I got lazy. So you just have the letters, but here you see Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, Romanian, Dutch, Icelandic, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian. Do those words look like Easter to you? What do they look like? Pascha. It is true that all those people, Christians speaking that language, use the term that means Passover. So, is that a surprise for you? Huge surprise. So, I mean, you get it? I thought all of us call it Easter and then those outliers call it something else. No, we're the outliers. Because it's really only English-speaking people, and one exception is German, which uses the term Ostern. Only English and German uses this other term. Everybody else calls this season and this celebration Passover. So maybe, I'm not forgetting about the Easter question, but let's talk about Passover then. Why are Christians using that as the term for this era, and I want to say holidays, occasion? And so for that, shall we remind everybody of these Bible stories? And everybody understands, don't they, that if you're Christian or Jewish, you know these stories, because what Christians call the Old Testament is really the Hebrew Bible, right? When Christianity comes along, then Christians said, okay, we'll make the Hebrew Bible part of our Bible too, and then they add a really shorter section, which they call the New Testament. So whether you're Christian or Jewish, you've probably heard some of these stories, and especially everybody knows the story of the Exodus. In other words, real quickly, the Hebrew people are in slavery in Egypt, and Moses arises as a leader, and he says to the Pharaoh, let my people go, and the Pharaoh doesn't want to do that. Everybody know this story, right? And because the Pharaoh won't listen, then he says, God gives this message and keeps saying, okay, tell him I'm going to give, I don't know if they gave the number at the beginning, but anyway, I'm going to keep giving plagues till I can convince this Pharaoh. And here's the list of plagues. Water turns to blood, frogs, fire and hail, locusts, all the rest. None of this changes Pharaoh's mind. And finally, the last one and the worst is there is the threat that if you don't free the Hebrew people, death will come over all these homes. I used to say an angel of death, but it really is just God says this is going to happen. And the firstborn, human beings and animals will all die. That's a big threat. And you know this Bible story, right? So Moses gives instructions to the Hebrew people and says, you need to sacrifice a lamb. Every family needs to have a lamb. If you're not big enough to have one, share it with your neighbors, but everybody has to have a lamb. You sacrifice it, you put the blood over the doorway, which will mark you as protected people. And then, by the way, you are supposed to then eat, you know, have a special meal and eat the meat from the lamb. And that's then what happens is, let's say, the angel of death comes, the firstborn of all kinds of people die, and except for the Hebrew people because of this. The angel of death, you can say, passed over, right? That's the story, and it's part of Exodus. And then what happens? The Pharaoh relents, lets the people go, and that's where you have Moses parting the Red Sea and all the other stories that follow. This is Passover. And several points in Hebrew Scripture, in the Christian Old Testament, God says, remember this. Every year, remember this. In fact, when this is happening, this is going to be the first month of the year. And, well, can you read this? Remember this day where you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, how God delivered you from it with a mighty hand. There's verse after verse in Hebrew Scriptures that said, remember this, do this annually. And so, I mean, if you're Jewish or if you have Jewish friends, you know, the Passover meal that many have, a ritualized meal that will happen during Passover, and it's very ritualized, remembering what happened. Okay, I always thought that was a Jewish thing, right? What does that have to do with Christianity, and what does that have to do with the Easter period? Well, first of all, everybody fully understands Jesus was a Jew, right? Sometimes I said this in classes and I see jaws drop. So, you know, Mary and Joseph were Jewish. When Jesus was taken to the synagogue, that's Jewish. When he's quoting or reading Scripture, that's Jewish. I mean, Jesus was a Jew, and he was doing Jewish things, and his audience was Jewish. Almost everyone he dealt with in his movement, they were all Jewish. It only spreads beyond Judaism kind of after Jesus with Paul and others. So Jesus is a Jew, and he does Jewish things. At that time, Passover is not a family meal. It is everybody who is supposed to come to Jerusalem, because that's where the temple is, and that's where the lamb is slaughtered, and that's where various ceremonies take place. So if possible, all good Jews will come to Jerusalem for Passover. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, not just any old time. Why is he coming, Palm Sunday, etc.? Why is Jesus coming to Jerusalem? Because it's Passover. So the whole context of everything that Christians talk about, you know, from Palm Sunday to, of course, things don't turn out really well because you're going to end up having an arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and crucifixion and fortunately resurrection. The context for all that's, when does that happen? It's Passover. So this happens in the Passover period. And if it's not clear, I mean, I've read these Bible verses all the time, but it somehow just kind of escapes my mind that he's there to do Passover things. So even the meal that we end up calling the Last Supper, it's a Passover meal, but not necessarily with family, but you do that when you're in Jerusalem. So, for instance, in Mark, when they arrive, on the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus' disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? I mean, if you read the passages that Christians read in this period of the Holy Week, it says Passover, Passover. Why did that never fully register to me that that's the context for what's happening? And then there's something else special happens here because, of course, the crowds are gathering. A lot of people have high expectations. The idea that Jesus is crucified was not kind of part of the expectation. And for a while, the followers of Jesus are distraught and, what's going on, but then they learn about the resurrection. It takes a little while, but do you see that once they start to see what has happened, they say, this is kind of a new Passover, because the blood of the Lamb in the Passover story saved the people. Jesus is the new Lamb, and the blood of Jesus also saves the people. Do you get that? I mean, this is not a subtle connection. And I realize that, here's an image for this. So you have Jesus on the cross. The blood of Jesus it's like a new Passover lamb. And these days, sometimes people talk about cultural appropriation. People of another culture shouldn't do things from somebody else's culture if they don't really understand it. However, of course, these people are all Jewish. Right? So they all know all this whole Jewish story. And for them, knowing the Passover story, they say this is the new Passover, which is why, because people keep asking me, why do you have lambs in church stained glass windows? What's that for? Because Jesus is the Passover lamb. And even prayers that some Christians say, Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world, have mercy upon us. Lamb of God, why? Because this is directly Christians picking up the Passover lamb story from Judaism, and that's what Jesus is about. Which is why, now I understand why all these other Christians, they don't call this Easter, they call it Passover. So I still have people wonder, and I wondered for most of my life, why are lambs up there in the stained glass window? That's why. Jesus is the Passover lamb. Everybody with me so far? Okay. I still didn't answer that Easter question, did I? Except I have, before I get to I'm going to drag this out for you. There is another relationship with, if I really fully understand how what happens with Christianity comes straight out of Judaism and its traditions, this also helps answer another question that we might have, and that is, why does the Easter date keep moving around all the time? Right? It's early or late. What the heck is happening here? And it's partly because Christians want to have Easter at least at a similar time as Passover because they see it as a Passover. And for that, once I get into calendar things, my head starts to hurt. But let's talk about something about calendars. So the calendar we live under is a solar calendar, which was ancient Rome and all that. And it's based on the change of seasons and how the earth is positioned with the sun. So it's in a solar calendar. We have 12 months and 7 days of the week, but also we have the winter solstice and the summer solstice. Winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. Summer solstice is the longest, and then in between each we have an equinox, which was halfway between one solstice and another. That's all about relationship with the sun, and that's the culture we live in. But there are cultures that organize themselves differently, and there are also lunar calendars, and what that operates on is the phases of the moon. So from one full moon to another full moon. And if you organize a calendar that way, a lunar month is a little bit shorter than a solar month. So when you map one over on the other, it doesn't quite map, and anyway, it's very different. In addition, some people say Judaism is based on a lunar calendar. No, it's on a lunisolar calendar, which means they're combining a little bit of each. So, how do Jews calculate when they'll have Passover? I've phrased this carefully because they don't calculate it exactly this way, but more or less, Passover is usually it happens after the first full moon on or after the vernal, in other words, the spring equinox. So in other words, you have the spring equinox, and after, which is halfway between one solstice and the other. Does your head hurt? Mine does. So you have the spring equinox, and then the first full moon after that, which it might take a while for the moon to get there, and it's around then that Jews had Passover. So Christians say, when are we going to celebrate our Christian Passover? Well, it better be, some people say, it should be on the very same day that the Jewish people do. And others said, no, not exactly, because doesn't Christianity say that the resurrection, this is Sunday. We need to have ours be on a Sunday. And the Jewish calculation, it could be different days of the week. So they said, we'll make it close, but a little different. So if you want to know, how do we figure out when is Easter? It's this. And I tried to memorize that, but even I get confused, which is why I put it on the screen. Easter every year is the first Sunday after the first full moon on or after the vernal spring equinox. Does that sound a little complicated? But do you see, the equinox is a solar thing. The first full moon is a moon thing, right? It's lunar and solar together. And the first Sunday after that. So, if you want to know about this year, the spring equinox was March 19th. And then, the phases of the moon go by, and so the first full moon was March 25th. It's not happened yet, but that's what it's going to happen this year. And then, what's the first, and March 25th, by the way, is a Monday. So then you got to wait till the end of the week, the first Sunday after that. That's March 31st. That's how we get our current Easter. And the spring equinox does not change much. It's not the March 19th, 20th, or 21st. But the phases of the moon aren't aligned with that, and so that could really stretch things out. Here's, I think, when you talk about how does Easter move around, I think this is so fascinating. I don't know who did this. This is somebody who calculated, the years are all here, Easter dates from 1700 to 2299. If you had a doctoral thesis for that, I don't know how long it would take to calculate all this. But, and I'm not sure if my note, well, I'll try. The 31st is Easter this year, and you'll notice up there, it's one of the most frequently, occurring dates. And it's right there kind of in the middle above the line. It says 2024. But the range is from March 22nd to April 25th. It could occur any of these times. And over all these years, it keeps moving around. And how is it? It's from those three things that we did. I mean, can you memorize that now? I don't know if I can. And by the way, while we're at it, if you're curious about, it's very interesting that the three major Western religions are all having their special time here this spring. And that doesn't always happen. So for us, I'd say me, because I'm a Christian background, March 31st is Easter this year. Lent goes from February 14th to March 31st. By the way, trivia here, if you sat down with the calendar and you started with February 14th, which another irony was also Valentine's Day this year. That doesn't usually happen. But anyway, if you started from February 14th and just counted the days, and then you got to March 31st, so Lent is 40 days. So would that be 40 days? Yes, some people don't. No, it's not. Why? Because Sundays don't count. So Lent is 40 days, except every Sunday is supposed to be like a little Easter, and so it's not counted in that, which I know I have friends who say, okay, if I give up things for Lent, like I gave up chocolate, then I can have a vacation from that on Sunday, right? And then other people say, oh, you're cheating, don't do that. But anyway, so that's Easter. Passover, usually, this is a very unusual year. Ordinarily, Passover, Easter occurs on the Sunday after Passover. That's what happens almost all the time, but not this year. Every once in a while, these calendars trying to line up, it goes kind of haywire, and you'll notice it's really different this year in that Passover is almost 3 weeks after Easter for us this year. My head hurts too much to even try to explain that, but it's an unusual year. Usually, Easter, our Jewish friends will have Jewish Passover, and the Sunday after that will be Easter for Christians. Not this year, really different. The other thing that's interesting is that Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, this year is March 10th or 11th. There's different Muslim groups have different ways of calculating this, but it starts either March or 10th and 11th, and it's a month, so April 9th and 10th. Ramadan, Islam functions on a lunar calendar, totally lunar calendar, phases of the moon, which means, see, Passover and Easter are always in the spring. They are always in March or April. You might think it moves, but it's always in March or April. Ramadan, because it follows a lunar calendar matched up with solar, it moves around the year. Every year it moves forward earlier in the solar calendar 11 days, which means that Ramadan is sometimes in the spring, but sometimes in the winter, and sometimes in the fall, and sometimes in the summer. It just so it takes 30-some days, or 30-some years to go through that. But this is kind of an unusual year where, at least in the same spring, we have Jews, Christians, and Muslims all having kind of a holy day here in this same general time period. Okay, that's calendar stuff. I keep saying that. I just get dizzy. Okay, I'm not really ignoring you. The Easter. What about Easter? Does anybody? I mean, all truth comes if you just Google it. Does anybody look this up about where did we get Easter as a title? Nobody's volunteering. Okay, I didn't. I mean, until I started to do this research, I never even thought to ask the question. What's Easter? Well, it's when we celebrate, I've already made the point. The one other language that uses a word like that is German, and German uses Ostern. But where did we get that term? And if you ask people who've kind of looked this up, they say it's because of an early English spring goddess. Whose name was Estra, written different ways, and the month in which she was celebrated was April, and whatever that, it's more or less Estra month. So isn't this an odd thing, that the Christian celebration of the resurrection of Jesus is called by a name because of a pre-Christian goddess? And how did we get this idea? People ask me, well, is that true? And I said, my answer is, well, maybe. Because it's very confusing. And what it comes from is there's this guy, have you ever heard of him in the history classes? Bede, the Venerable Bede, was a monk in England in the 600s and the 700s. And he was just known for, he wrote a whole bunch of books, and he wrote a book, this is kind of a modern, called The Reckoning of Time. It's a whole book about how early Christians argued about exactly when should we have Easter. A whole book about this. And in the process, he talks about the English culture before the Christians got there in England. And he lists the different months and what they called each month. And in the list, he says, and by the way, those old manuscripts were not like typeset. This is like the page. in that page, he says, this is 2 sentences. I don't know if this is confusing or not. I don't know how to pronounce that. Estra month has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Estra, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now, they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observances. You get what that says? I mean, first of all, more or less it's saying, until the Christians showed up, they had this goddess, and they called the month by her name. And so even though Christianity's now here, and we're doing this thing about Jesus, they still call this by that older name. The odd thing about this is, except for these 2 sentences, we can't find any other evidence of anything about such a goddess. In other words, there are no writings before B that say anything. There's no archaeological pots or any. We know nothing else except for these 2 sentences. So some Christians who don't like this say, well, I don't like it. He must have made it up, although he's a monk, he's a Christian trying to advance Christianity. I don't know what to think about that. I think most people would never even have noticed that he said this, except 1,000 years later, there came the Grimm brothers. Heard of Grimm's, And these 2 brothers, one of them was a folklorist, and he got into this, interest in various goddesses. And he's got no archaeological evidence. He just uses linguistics and looks at the names and says, look at Roman gods and goddesses there were, and then there's Bede, and so he picks up this thing that nobody noticed. And then also Jacob Grimm says, and for Germans we have Astera, and so this is a whole tradition of the same goddess through all these cultures. And it's all from 2 people writing 1,000 years apart from each other with almost no supporting evidence. I don't know what to do with that. I mean, it may be true that there was such a goddess. I just don't know. But I'll tell you, I don't know if this troubles you or doesn't or whatever, I'll tell you my answer. There's a blank screen so you can really hear what I'm talking about. Do you notice that underneath, linguistically, underneath, whether we call it Easter or Estra or all the rest, is the word east? I think we should think about that. I'm not the first person to say this. So what's east? Well, it's one of the 4 directions, right? And what's special about east? The sun rises there, right? Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. So the sun rising is the beginning of a new day, right? And if you did it in terms of seasons, it could be like the spring, of a new season. And I mean, in general, I'm suggesting that east is a word that simply points to dawn, new day, spring, new season, things spring to life, really new life. And I can see why all kinds of people would use east as a good symbol. And so I can see why, if there was a goddess that they talked about back then, they might give her a name like that. But I also can see why Christians would like it too. Because isn't all this Christianity talk about new life? Both Jesus resurrected and new life for people. So for me, I don't think you have to go to these kind of other arguments, and I don't know what you want to think about that goddess. Easter doesn't bother me because it's a word that in general means new life, and it's something I think that appeals to a lot of us as human beings. And now let me give you another quick little theory, analogy that I've come up with as I've studied these various holidays, which helps me understand what's going on with many of the holidays. I'm not saying every holiday is like this, but my claim would be that if you look at it, holidays mostly are 3-layer cakes. I'm being clever. I hope you're impressed here. And here are the 3 layers. The first, the bottom layer is, I think, most of the celebrations that you can see in cultures and in religions, they start as seasonal celebrations. And all of us should be able to understand that. You know, go back into prehistory. Doesn't it make sense that if people survived a hard winter, when spring comes and something's growing up, you'd want to dance, right, and celebrate? You just have a whole different spirit. Or if the weather, the crops get in the fall, and now that work is over, but you're a little afraid of the winter that's coming, don't you think you'd want to celebrate that the harvest is in? Or even if you have a long, hard winter, one way you could survive a winter is have a big party in the middle of it, because it would help you survive. You get the idea? I think human beings, as long as there have been human beings, have had seasonal celebrations, and they make total sense to me. I mean, like I've had, when I talk about Christmas, I've said, I think it's a really good idea if this winter hasn't been too bad, but a lot of winters, to suffer through winter, one way you could just get through winter is let's have a big blowout midwinter celebration in the middle. It just would help. And I've often said, if I didn't live in a culture that already had a midwinter celebration, I'd make one up. So I get how seasonal celebrations are important. Then what happens is, what I usually say is a religion or a nation comes along and adds a new level of meaning on top of the already existing seasonal celebration. And in this case, we're talking about Judaism, because a Jewish rabbi will tell you, even before they had an annual Exodus Passover celebration, before that they already had a spring festival at the same time. So in this case, it's kind of 2 middle layers. Judaism and Christianity both come along and add layers of meaning on top of the seasonal celebration that already existed. And then, my little analogy is, and then on top of that, you get modern popular culture comes along, and who knows what that does with the other 2 layers. But I think if you look at a lot of holidays and see what's going on, if you can see the 3 layers, makes sense. Which leads me to, okay, this next question, and that is, what about all this other stuff that gets associated with Easter? Like bunnies and eggs. Clever statement for some people is, since when do bunnies lay eggs? Because they don't. So how do we get those, and how do we understand them? And I think if you understand them, if you understand what I just said about, they start as a seasonal celebration, then religious meetings get added on top, and then modern popular culture. So what about these bunnies? It's a pretty simple answer, and that is, rabbits are a symbol of fertility. Which is, by the way, even, Playboy had the Playboy bunny. But you also, rabbits are fertile. Does everybody know that? They reproduce a lot. I mean, I remember this joke about a farmer was chasing some rabbits with a gun, and these 2 rabbits ran around the barn, and one rabbit said to the other, "What are we going to do?" And the other rabbit said, "Don't worry, let's just wait and we'll outnumber him." And if you wonder why they say that rabbits are so, can proliferate so much, here's a little science lesson for you. The gestation for a rabbit is 28 days. And a doe can get pregnant, I know it's up here, but I'll read it to you. A doe can get pregnant the day she gives birth. There are possibility of carrying 2 litters at a time. You could get up to 14 kits a litter, although the average is usually 7. And by the way, it's less than 30 days after a young bunny is born that it can be reproductive. It matures rapidly. So that's why you get a whole bunch of rabbits, right? And to make this even more dramatic, have you ever had Animal shelters and the rest will say, please neuter or spay or neuter your pets, because otherwise, if just left to go, it will lead to all kinds of, that's why we have overproduction. And I've heard vets give this statistic. What they're saying is, if you didn't neuter a cat or a dog, and this is the quote, worst case scenario. So how many other cats and dogs could they create over and over again as rapidly as possible for 7 years? But also every one they created would do the same over and over again. And this is the worst case scenario, because maybe some of them wouldn't create constantly, and maybe some of them would die for whatever reason. But worst case scenario, if they all lived and they all procreated as much as possible, and you didn't spay this animal, or two of them, after 7 years you'd have had created 120,000. Which is why the vet is trying to say, please spay or neuter your animal. Now, why am I telling you this? If you applied the same thing to rabbits, it would be 61 billion. Which, okay, so if you want to know why rabbits in this season, it's gonna be associated with spring fertility. Another thing, though, that I've started to notice is there's a difference between a rabbit and a hare. And most of the stories that come out of Europe is about a hare. They're actually different, even different species. The hare has longer legs, more powerful, hops, nests above ground. When the babies are born, they're born with fur and eyes open, and they're abandoned by the parent almost immediately. And I mean, they're really a hare is really powerful. For me, a little scary. And a rabbit is more furry. When the rabbits are born, they're born without hair, blind, totally dependent on the mother. Rabbits have burrows underground, which is a good thing because the mother has to protect these. And it's kind of like hares are, for me, hares are kind of scary and rabbits are kind of cuddly, when you say. And the thing is, if you look at some of the traditions in Europe, they'll talk about the Easter hare. But in the United States, pretty thoroughly, it's always about the bunny. And I think what's happened is American culture in the 1800s and 1900s has been interested in making this not about sex or procreation, but about child-friendly, cuddly, and not scary. Right? I think our culture has worked on that. And if you think about it, think of all these examples. Alice's, Adventures in Wonderland, Peter Rabbit, Velveteen Rabbit, Peter Cottontail, Bugs Bunny cartoon. I mean, I do think we have a culture that, I don't think of the Playboy bunny now. I think about cute little cuddly things because we've wanted to make it more cuddly. What about eggs? I don't even know where I am. Okay, I'm getting there. What about eggs? I suppose it could be a symbol of fertility, but mainly eggs, almost every world religion has eggs somewhere in their symbolism. Partly because it's not an exact circle, but it's kind of round, which is a symbol of eternity and so on. And the other thing is eggs that look like a rock or something, they're hard, and unbelievably, something breaks out of, it's like a miracle, isn't it? And so you have what some world religions have, the creation story is a giant egg and everything emerges out of the egg. And so other religions have used that, but I can see why Christianity would use it too. How can you, it's this symbol of birth and rebirth. Look at this little, it's a miracle. And how could you not listen to the Christian story, right, about the tomb and then it's empty and resurrection and not use the same symbol? So I think even though it also comes from spring, it seems to be an appropriate Christian symbol that it works. While we're at that, I don't know if you know, in Russia, the tradition for Russian Orthodox, and about half of all Eastern Orthodox are Russian Orthodox. What they will have is not the pastel eggs that we usually have, they're all red. And there are various legendary stories told about it. One legendary story is that Mother Mary brought a basket of eggs to soldiers when Jesus was imprisoned, and in tears asked the soldiers to take good care of her son, and as her tears fell on the eggs turned red. Or another story, and this is here, I won't expect you to read all this, but this is the other Mary, which is Mary Magdalene, who the story says got an audience with the emperor and rebuked him for the crucifixion of Jesus because it was unfair. And she, usually if you go to see an emperor, you bring a gift. All she had was a white egg in her hand. And when she handed it to the emperor said, she said to him, Christ is risen. And the emperor said, a man rising from the dead is as likely as a white egg turning red. At which point the egg in her hand turned red. That's the story. But anyway, there is a Russian tradition with red eggs. There's also, which is important to me these days because I care about what's happening with Ukraine, is Ukrainian eggs. This is Ukraine and somewhat Poland. You know, these beautiful, beautiful eggs, that's where they come from. One question, I'm trying to wind this up, one other question that I was asked last year that I have never thought about is, of all the flowers you have for Easter, why the Easter lily? Anybody ever thought to ask that? I didn't. I've done some research since. And if you look things up, like I say, if you Google, all the truth is there, not quite. Some of these websites are by florist associations and so on, and they'll say things like, lilies are mentioned 20-some times in the Bible. That's not quite true. Well, it's true. The word in English is lilies, but it isn't designated a particular flower. And if you go to the biblical people and, you know, the Hebrew and so on, what's being talked about there, we really just don't know. So as you read mention of lilies in the Bible, really what you should do in your head is say that means flower. We don't really know what kind of flower. And in fact, when you talk about lilies of the valley, we're talking about wildflowers out there somewhat, and then people say, well, what wildflowers were common in Jesus' time. So there's not really, here I'll put the Easter lily up in front of you. It's not because of the Bible. And there are legends about when Jesus died in the cross, that lilies grew up from the blood at the foot of the cross, or from his tears in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's nothing biblical that says that. This particular lily doesn't ever come to the West until about the 1800s. So if you claim all this stuff about all these centuries it's been the Easter flower, that's not true. This flower arose on 3 little islands in this, I don't know how to pronounce that, Ryukyu. The Ryukyu Islands, 3 islands there that are kind of part of Japan. That's where this flower started, and then eventually Japanese and Chinese cultivated this flower, but it never made it to the West until about the 1800s. So that recently it has become the Easter flower. There is another flower that's similar, and it's called the Madonna lily. And so you could mistake this for the Easter lily, except if you'll notice, there's not as much of a trumpet shape, it's flatter, and these flowers are smaller. And the other advantage of an Easter lily is that in the hothouse flower, you can manage it so that it'll bloom at the right time. And that's what you want to do with an Easter lily. You don't want it blooming at Christmas time. And so you can manage the Easter lily that other way. And so I think this, oh, and I didn't say about the last one, the Madonna lily you can find in medieval art, but it's not associated with Easter, it's associated with various saints, so that they will have a white flower with them. So we don't really know. All I know is it doesn't go back to the Bible, and it doesn't go to centuries of tradition. But I can guess why it's become the favorite Easter flower now, because white represents purity. And the shape of that flower, it's like a trumpet, right? Which doesn't it seem to fit the Easter mood? Okay, got to finish up one thing here. So what about commercialization? It strikes me that while there's some holidays that have been so commercialized, this has not been so much, right? It's certainly not Halloween or Christmas, but there are things we could talk about, like, you know, Easter baskets and so on, like candy. You know, I was talking to one person who's involved in the candy business, and I said, you know, in my studying these 5 holidays in that book, every one has some association with candy. And he said, and that's not by accident. So you have candy and all that. This is, do you remember this? Do you remember, if you're old enough, that there was a time when everybody in the family had to have a nice, you know, new clothes, children and parents, and for some families that was the only time of the year that you got new clothes, right? That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, nobody dresses up for anything anymore, but in a way, that's a way that Easter has become less commercialized, I guess you'd say. The other thing that I think is interesting is the Easter parade, made famous by the movie, Irving Berlin, and the song, by the way, Irving Berlin, you know, who also did White Christmas, is Jewish. It was a real thing, the Easter parade. Here's a scene from the movie, and there's no religion in that movie. They don't talk about the Easter story at all. This is the end of the movie. And if you see at the end, there's a church in the background. I would say that's the only religion in the whole movie, is that it happens to be the background for what was the Easter parade, which means people got dressed up, went to church, big churches in Manhattan, and then they all paraded down Fifth Avenue, and everybody could see the finery that you were wearing. This was a real thing. If you wonder if it still happens, it does, although now people aren't always so dressed up, but it has become all about hats, which, by the way, also makes me think, we used to talk about Easter bonnets, and I don't know how many people wear Easter bonnets, but there is still an Easter parade in New York City, and it's mostly about hats rather than costumes. And in fact, New York City has now called it the Easter Parade and Bonnet Festival. That's what they call it. And this still happens. Somebody asked, is it still happening like post-COVID? I don't know. I haven't been there, except this picture is from last year. So I need to wrap this up. I mean, what you do, if you see everything, see how I've wandered around and told you about everything else. But I do think it's helpful, if you want to understand Easter and other holidays, to think about them as 3-layer cakes. We talked about seasonal celebration, Jewish and Christian layers of meaning on top, and then popular culture. We talk about the importance of Passover, and the fact a whole bunch of Christians call it Passover. But then there's the Christian layer on top of that. And yes, you have aspects of popular culture in addition to that. But I think it's all about new life, and that's a theme I really like. Thanks.